Let me begin by talking briefly about something that is totally different, but related to Frederick Douglass. Bear with me for a few minutes. First of all, there's this horrible practice called female genital mutilation. It's basically the intentional cutting off of the parts of female genitals for no reason whatsoever. It's like circumcision for Jewish boys, but they universally do to all women in certain parts of the world. It's done often between the ages of infancy to 15. It's an ancient cultural practice that predates Christianity, often in Africa and Southeast Asia. It's horrible, and there's no need for me to get into why it's horrible. Again, there is no medical reason to do this. Now, is it right or wrong? Should it be outlawed? You could take a moral relative position and say that there's no such thing as a transcendent values or morality, just personal preference. Thus, you cannot impose values on someone else, other than a will to power and coercion. You could take a cultural relativist position. Again, there are no such things as transcendent moral values if you believe in that. Only the customs and norms of a culture, and no culture can impose its values on another culture. They're all equally, relatively valid. It can only do one culture can only do so by military and cultural imperialism, that is conquest and imposing one value set on another value. This practice of female genital mutilation, it's cultural and it's religious. It's done for the ostensible purpose of moral purity and beauty, whatever. It's awful. And so Western modern people are not allowed to outlaw it if you are cultural or moral relativist. Before the Civil War, the South argued that slavery was what they call a peculiar institution, a peculiar custom, and the South had unique ways of doing things that were alien to the ways of the North. And thus the North had no right to impose their values on the South. It's like saying you Northerners have your way of doing things, and we Southerners have our Southern way of doing things. They were, in a sense, arguing for a cultural or moral relativistic position. We have our way, and it's good. It's good for us, not for you. As we can see, slavery was far more than simply a set of working conditions for a certain group of people. The entire cultural framework, including religion, of the South was marshaled to create a thick system of reality that supported slavery and dehumanized the slave. In the eyes of the white master class and in the mind of the slave himself, the slave was made to be dehumanized, and thus that justified all the horrible stuff that came with slavery. Now, you could take a cultural relativist or a moral relativist position of slavery and say, oh, well, slavery is just different. That's their way of doing things. But we don't, of course. We say the slavery as practiced in the South is just wrong, period. It's not a matter of different customer preferences. It's rooted in something higher. They are, say, God and God's morality. So some cultures are corrupt, or rather, cultures have corrupt practices in them, and these things should be judged and rooted out. I said before how Douglas's life took a modern turn. By modern, I mean he rejected the entire culture under which his identity was formed and shaped. That is, his Southern culture taught him that he was not a man, not a person, not a human being. He is more akin to an animal or Southern livestock on a farm. A slave was mostly just a human, except a loyal and grateful cow, more than a person with dignity and status. But Douglas broke away from this ideology. He thought for himself, and that was his modern turn. He thought for himself in rebellion against his culture and his society, everything he was taught. But how did he come to see this? How did he come to this modern turn? How did he invent himself? Or rather, how did he invent a self when the South conspired to deny him that he even had a self? He found the tools to critique and condemn his Southern slave culture by tapping into the tools, the resources of another culture. Again, he learned how to read against the will of his masters. And by learning how to read, he eventually came across this book for young boys called The Columbian Orator. The Columbian Orator was an anthology that included speeches by George Washington, Ben Franklin, and some imagined speeches by historical figures such as Socrates and Cato. Now, these weren't their real speeches, but they were speeches that Socrates or Cato might have actually given. These fictional speeches were deeply rooted in the philosophy and ideology and the writings of Socrates and Cato. By reading Columbian Orator, by reading Washington, Franklin, and something of the ideas of Socrates and Cato, it helped Douglas understand ideas of freedom, human dignity, and human rights, or rather introduce him to ideas of freedom, rights, and dignity. It's not that Douglas just sat alone in a slave hovel a la Descartes and thought, and through the sheer power of his genius level intellect, which he was a genius, and his fierce determination of will and he did have a fierce determination will, or by brute force. It's not that he just thought like, "Argh," grabbed himself through like a bomb. And through this fierce power and solitude, Douglas overcame the ideology of slavery. That would truly be a very modern term. But no, Douglas actually was both modern and actually anti modern. He countered bad ideology with a better ideology. He found the tools to rebuke an evil culture by looking for a good culture, or rather, finding a good culture. But this new choice of a new culture, it's not just functional, it's not just utilitarian, as in Douglas thinking, I want to not be a slave, so I'm going to use any ideology that I can find, any culture out there that will get me what I want. In other words, culture is merely a tool towards my good ends, and my end is not to be a slave anymore. No, in reading the Columbian Orator, Douglas saw a glimpse of the good, the true, the beautiful, and the holy, meaning there is an eternal and transcendent truth. In many ways, was Douglas very modern? Yes, in many ways he was, by rebelling against his thick culture. And in many ways he was actually anti-modern by finding a pre-modern eternal idea.